Off your launch Diamond Mind here in Melbourne at the Corner Hotel the other night. How did it all go?
Fantastic. It was a really, really good gig. So everyone was really pleased.
What are your hopes for this album? What will be a pleasing result to come out of it all for you?
Well, I mean, it's a long haul sort of album, but most of mine have been because my album's like Goodbye Tiger, which is 27 years old. I mean, Goodbye Tiger still sells. So our plan for this is to promote it over a period of at least another 12 months, and hopefully by that stage get to gold or platinum.
Fantastic. The reviews have been, and deservedly so, very good to this point. What would be the main contributing factor that made the whole thing work for you?
Well, the reviews have been good because this album, like any other, I did in isolation to a great degree. Because usually you've got record company people around you and everybody sort of passing opinions and stuff, whereas this time I did it over a very long period of time just on my own. So getting out into the big wide world and getting all this feedback has been tremendous value for me.
But during the recording process, it would have been that pressure release, not having that hanging over you, that would have been a main help?
Oh, yeah, look, it's been fantastic because it's been a very liberating sort of experience because I haven't had to worry about time and money, and so this is the first time in my career, like out of 18 albums, where I haven't had those sort of constraints. And for me, it's sort of... I know all artists say it's the best album I've ever done, but I think in this case it's probably true because I've been able to develop these songs to the point where for the first time I'm sort of 100% happy with the whole album and with every song on it.
Would it be the biggest creative control you've ever had over one of your records?
Oh yeah, unquestionably.
Yeah. You think you've discovered the best possible way to record now, having this luxury of being able to record at your own pace and time?
Yeah, not only that, I mean, I think this will be the future of music. This is how music will be made in the future, because with an ever-diminishing sort of financial factor in the music industry itself and record companies downsizing, I think we've seen the last of albums, $500,000 albums. And so I've noticed already over the last few years that younger bands tend to use Pro Tools or Cubase or Logic and record their albums entirely at home. Because you're talking about a difference between about $20,000 or $25,000 investment to $500,000.
In hindsight, do you think any of your past albums that could have benefited from this approach?
Yeah, I mean, especially the 70s albums, which I suppose, I had a much higher kind of pop profile in those days. So there was always a constant sort of pressure on you to deliver an album a year with scant regard to whether all the tracks were good. And if I think about albums like the Girls on the Avenue album, especially because that was done in such a rush, there's regrettable tracks on that for me. I don't know about nowadays, but in the 70s and 80s, you used to call these sort of songs fillers, and most artists sort of suffered from that kind of syndrome of, there'd be a few good tracks, but then the rest of them would be fillers. Yeah.
What about an album like Goodbye Tiger? I remember speaking to Kirk Larange once, and he told me that the recording of that album was like pulling teeth at times.
No, it was. It was. That was a big. That album was done in complete turmoil, and it's taken me a long while to adjust to it myself. I mean, and I share that empathy with Michael Hegarty, who was the bass player on that album. And it wasn't at all a comfortable experience. It was quite horrendous, quite frankly. But in retrospect, I can see that in a similar way to Neil Young's Tonight's the Night, sometimes the best art is produced from chaos and angst and etc.
Yeah, for sure. So he contributed to the charm of the record.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. In parts on this album, and there is certainly a mix of styles and sounds, but in some parts there is a return to what many would consider to be the classic Richard Clapton sound. Some Sunny Day, for example, sounds as though it could have come off any of those late 70s, early 80s albums. Was that an intentional thing for you to capture that feel again?
Actually, In reality, no, because the slide guitar on Some Sunny Day, Dave Leslie ended up. We actually we tried various guitar sort of attitudes on that track, and we're finding that I don't know, the first 3 or 4 kind of evolutions of that song didn't really suit it, so we ended up just caving in, and one day Dave just said, "Mate, do you mind if I try a slide on this?" And I said, "No, go ahead." And I think you'll find it's more the slide guitar on it than anything else that gives it that Goodbye Tiger sort of feel to it. But it's part of my DNA, and so it's definitely not a negative factor. I mean, I think it's a big plus.
Oh, absolutely not. That's right, yeah. How much have you allowed it have you allowed it to frustrate you over the years that despite still pulling out quality albums over the past decade or so, the only time we'll hear you on the commercial radio is in that classic rock format?
Well, that's about to change, thank God, because there's a new Nova station going up in Sydney, either late this year or early next year, which is a music station for baby boomers. So, in other words, for a 40-plus audience, and hopefully that will be the saviour of this genre of music.
Fantastic. So playing new music from artists of that era.
Yeah, exactly.
That's brilliant. Good to hear. Does it get to a point in time where you just have to accept commercial radio the way it is?
Yeah, I do, but I've sort of been making comments in the media that I think the media has to have a think about what's coming up, because I'm noticing I've got twin 14-year-old daughters, and between the two of them, they've probably got, 30 or 40 friends. And at that age, young teenage girls have their friends over for sleepovers and stay for a couple of days. And my observation of kids of that age, are they listening to the radio less and less? I mean, because there's just not the diversity on the airwaves that young kids want. They want to go out and discover their own thing. And so really, I think it's a bit dumb that radio hasn't or is ignoring the fact that the internet is not just sort of been hurting record companies. I think it's about to hit radio as well, because radio's got such a narrow Panama Canal of 40 or so songs on the playlist. Mm-hmm. But kids want to get out, surf the net, find their own bands, and where they get joy from music is finding their own fairly obscure bands. One of my daughters is into this band called Mudvayne at the moment, which is, she really tries to shock me with. It's one of those 666 satanic rock bands.
Oh, okay.
Come on, no, bring it on, turn it up. You want to rebel against your father. But no, they like finding their own, as I said, their own obscure bands. They don't want to be dictated to by radio programmers. So they surf the net, find their own bands, and then they just go out and sort of go on little crusades, turning all their friends onto these bands. And that's what I'm finding with younger teenagers. And so I guess in the next 2 to 4 years, radio's going to notice they're losing more and more younger listeners.
Yeah. Speaking of your daughters, there is a song for them on the album?
Yeah, Tides of Time, which is, it's not as directly about them as Little Pilgrims from my anthology, but it's just sort of a legacy that I just hope that one of these days, when they're a bit older, they'll hear the song and they'll find an empathy there that they can relate to.
What changed you over the years?
Well, it's definitely got my life in perspective, and I think it's good. Obviously being a parent, you can't afford to be that, as self-centered and selfish as you were as a young single person, because really then your raison d'etre really becomes, it's about somebody else. It's about my kids, Yeah. And I think that's been really good for me because, for a start, I'm sort of nailed down to a certain discipline, and that includes my career. I can't, like in the old days, especially in the 70s, I was always rebelling and just there was so many occasions in the 70s going into the 80s where I used to just jump on a plane and leave Australia and head back to Europe It wasn't necessarily a geographic thing. It was just that because the music industry here was sort of really affecting me that adversely, because I found it very difficult to come to terms between commerce and art, and understanding that the music industry is an industry, and the art of it has actually very little to do with it. It's a business.
Talking about some of the other tracks on the album, Bomb the Bomb, I believe, came out of a rather interesting life experience. Can you relate that one to us?
That came about because in Sydney, probably the biggest arterial road in Sydney is the Pacific Highway, which I think becomes part of Highway 1 ultimately. And just one morning in peak hour traffic, my wife was driving and she was gesticulating back at this guy that was harassing the hell out of it. There's just all this road rage going on around us, and I kept saying to my wife, look, if you don't stop doing this guy's going to jump out of his car and run over here with a gun or something, you know. And I was just sitting in this heavy traffic and just looking at how sort of miserable everybody was. You know, everyone weaving in and cutting in front of one another and all that kind of stuff, the stuff that goes on roads in modern life. And then we got towards the Harbour Bridge, and after all this bloody road rage on the Pacific Highway, when we got towards the city, it was just this beautiful clear day with this beautiful blue sky, and so I'm looking at the road rage going on around me, then I'm looking at the vista of Sydney skyline over Sydney Harbour. I'm thinking, it's such a beautiful day. I mean, God, can't we get over this, you know, try and look at the positive things in life rather than just the negatives.
Yeah, chill out,
Yeah.
Has the way in which songs come to you over the years changed? Has there been a change to your method or procedure?
Not really. In a nutshell, I usually write about my own experience and my own environment, which is why I've written so many songs that are ostensibly Australian or very Australian. And then also on each album, I'm always going to have things like Obsession, because I like pop music, you know, and I think a Richard Clapton album needs a bit of pop music on it just to lighten it up a bit, because otherwise, you know, you end up with too many tracks like Bomb the Bomb and Lucky that they're all very well. I mean, you know, I'm proud to have written so many songs of substance, but I've just got to lighten up a bit. So, you know, on this album, there's Obsession and Paradise Drive's fairly light songs. Not bad. They're not about anybody in particular. They're just sort of good pop songs.
Now, The Simple Things, it reflects on your time up at the Gold Coast. How do you look back on that time now? Was the original intent for you to settle there for good?
No, there wasn't any real intent. We just really wanted to get out of Sydney because it was born out of a crazy period. You know, because I met my wife 16 years ago in the late 80s, and we're sort of living a pretty hard life. Well, no, not a hard life. In fact, quite the opposite. There was just a lot of partying going on, and I was hanging around with NXS and Jimmy and Diesel, and you know, it was just it was a very full-on sort of partying lifestyle. And you know, in those days there was a lot more gigs, so I was working a lot more. And Susie just really, one day she just felt the need we just really had to get out of that loop. So we moved to the Gold Coast and found a very charming sort of simple life, which unfortunately I couldn't sustain. We only lasted there 3 or 4 years. I think it was around about 4 years, because the music scene in Queensland, it can get very frustrating, and so I realised, you know, very early in the piece I wouldn't be able to sort of make a permanent go of it there, so we had to move back to Sydney.
Right. Talking about some of the players on the album, how did all they come together? Did you have specific players in mind for specific roles?
No, not really. I mean, I've been writing and developing this album for about 4 years, and during that time, I mean, I know I'd already sort of exchanged production ideas with John Farris about Bomb the Bomb, and because Johnny just immediately loved the song, and so going, you know, turning the clock back a couple of years, I probably would have just resorted to the same sort of people that I've worked with for 22 years now, which is John Farris, Gary Beers from NXS, Ian Moss, Diesel, etc., etc. But In Excess have been out of Australia for a long time, and now it seems like now the general public know why, because of their new reality TV thing, whatever it is they've got happening in America. So they just weren't around, and I just, had long, hard chats with my manager, and Mark, my manager, said, look, it's really time to move on anyway. You've been, doing this on every album you've done for 22 years, because first time I used In Excess on an album was 1980 on The Great Escape. So I through mutual friends and through musician circles, I stumbled across Terrapai Whitlam, and Terrapai and I got on really well. And then he introduced me to his mate Sam Dixon, and so I just met a bunch of young guys who weren't even born when I had Girls in the Avenue, who just totally blew me away as players. And I think, Australia should be really proud of these guys and try and nurture these guys, because these are really not just world class. I mean, they're very special kind of musicians. So I'm very glad to have done this album with a whole bunch of young guys, pretty much. And then Diesel had been in Thailand, and Diesel came back from Thailand, and as soon as I realised he was back, I was really, really grappling with that song All Stand Together. So I called Mark up, and I think I virtually went over to Mark's place that afternoon, and we started doing All Stand Together. And then Ian Moss is just also, Mossy's sort of in my DNA, because he's pretty much played on every album for the last 22 years as well.
That's
so
right,
we had to have Ian on at least one track, and that was it.
A recent article proclaiming you as the godfather of Australian rock. Are you happy to wear that label?
Well, that was promo from the 80s, and that was because I'd just done the Glory Road album, and John Farris produced it, and Michael Hutchins was singing backing vocals, and Chisel were on it, and there was Alan Mansell from Dragon, blah, blah, blah. And my manager at the time just coined that phrase, because I think he was just in the studio one day, and it was just full of rock stars. Like, we had 4 In Excesses, and Alan from Dragon playing keyboards, and somebody from Chisel was in there as well. And, and Gary, my manager at the time, just said, so that, you're the godfather. Look at this,
Looking back now, just reflecting, have you ever pondered how your career or how your life may have panned out had you not spent that early time overseas before you began your music career back here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because, no, I don't know the answer to that one.
Not sure at all?
Not really, because I come from a very different era to young people. When I was young, life was just much freer, and there just wasn't this, there wasn't the pressure to conform that there is nowadays. And I was talking to a taxi driver yesterday here in Melbourne, and we were just saying that, like, nowadays life in Australia is just about a mortgage. It's pretty tragic, but nowadays people here in Australia can only live with their mortgage, and that's life. You live for your mortgage and you go to the mall. And unfortunately, things like live rock and roll in Australia are suffering from that. So what I'm saying is, I think I'm extremely privileged or lucky to have grown up in an era where I just sort of drifted through, quite frankly, and I just went with the tide of whatever was happening. It's been a fairly Buddhist kind of life for me, because I can't. It's very rare that I've ever had to really kick against the pricks or swim against the tide. I've just always been able to land on my feet. But then, as I said a bit earlier, I mean, now I'm married with children, and that changes that a bit as well.
Do you yearn for the days of a pub on every corner to play on, when there was just a plethora of venues, live venues around, the pre-poker machine days, I guess?
Yeah, well, that's why I still do Goodbye Tiger every night. And the more the years go on, the more people get emotionally swayed by that, or emotionally moved by that song. I even moved my bad self on that song.
recognised as someone who's not particularly fond of the business side of the music industry. Is that something you've learned to live with better in time?
Yeah, you just grow up and you just realise that a record company it's a business and it's run by bean counters and I mean, I had a very tumultuous first, say, 10, 12 years, and I was just always at loggerheads with the business, although that's probably got a lot to do with my DNA as well, because I was extremely rebellious, and I just really couldn't come to terms with the fact that it was all about having hit records and selling a lot of records, and art was like a very secondary consideration, you know, like, but I'm trying to remember the expression, you know, I've just learnt to, I don't know, peacefully coincide alongside with the industry, and it really doesn't faze me or upset me anymore. I think it's younger bands in their 20s are going through what I went through a long time ago.
Yeah.
Where they just, you know, I mean, with the downsizing the record companies now, you know, so many of the young bands are being dropped or can't get past doing their first single, even let alone their first album and stuff, and it's very, you know, if you really set your heart on a career in music, it's very traumatic, you know. But it's just finally you just come to the realisation, well, this is what it is. So you either accept it or you get out of it.
Now, your last album of new material was Angeltown, and that was backed by private investors.
Yeah.
In hindsight now, was that a successful venture for you and the investors?
No, it wasn't, to be candid and blunt about it, because I just did that with my lawyer at the time that I had in the 90s, and we were very naive. I mean, that was a predecessor to this album, which, you know, I've got Mark Pope managing me, and, you know, I've known Mark for a long while, but for me, Mark's about the best manager there is in this country, and he's just a lot more savvy with the music industry. So when we did Angeltown, we were very naive, and we just found, well, for a start, we weren't in the loop, you know, and if you're not in that loop of all the retail chains, etc., and in fact, that was the first time I'd had a tough time with radio, because even Distant Thunder, I had a Distant Thunder was quite easy, yeah, to get radio airplay on. Distant Thunder was 93, 94. But we had no airplay for Angeltown, because that was around about the time when radio really started to change its attitude, and we just weren't in with the retail chains. We didn't have good distribution, etc. So, but I've learned from all those mistakes, and hopefully this will be a different story with this album.
Did it put pressure on you knowing that there were individuals who'd put up their own money and I guess were hoping for some sort of return?
No, not really, because they've all been pretty good about it. All these people were pretty wealthy, and they just put in $5,000 each. And I mean, two of them were actually relatives of mine, so they weren't phased at all.
Okay. Now, you mentioned you're in for the long haul with this album, but touring-wise, what can we expect from you for the rest of the year?
Well, we're doing as much as we can. We've just done Perth, and we've just done Melbourne, and we're off to Adelaide in a couple of days, and then back to Sydney, and then I think up to Queensland. And I really do want to try and get back to Melbourne as much as I can, because I mean, I was really strong in Melbourne for about 25 years, and then I think more because of agency problems more than anything, it just sort of started to fall off. And I don't think because of public response or anything. I think it was just once again, it was a music business sort of thing that affected that.
Yeah.
So now I'm trying to rebuild, my audience in Melbourne, and we did Frankston and then the Corner Hotel, and both were really, there's heaps of people, gigs were really good, so it's we've got off to a good start.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations again on the album, Richard. It's great to have you back.
Thank you.
And hopefully we do get to see you back down in Melbourne again before the end of the year.
Love to.
Thanks for taking time out.
No worries.
Catch you later.
See
Cheers.
you, mate. Bye.